Transport infrastructure development continues to be a major concern on the African continent. A call has been made to African governments to accelerate reforms that will encourage more private sector investment in infrastructure projects. Philani Nyilunga has this report.
The economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa continues to rise from 4.7% in 2013 to a forecasted 5.2% in 2014, this according to the World Bank. However, this might change due to the continent's inadequate infrastructure. East Africa's largest economy risks a rapid debt escalation as it has committed to borrowing billions of shillings to finance mega public infrastructure projects.
Kenya's national debt is absolutely out of control. You could argue unsustainable. 80% of Kenya's debt is ODS debt. It has been the victim of very serious corruption. Allow me to say, suffice to say that every Kenyan, including a newborn, owes in national debt about Kenya shillings 30,000 each. That's about $400.
Another region's influential economy, Tanzania, has lost billions through poor transport infrastructure. This is delaying the country's economic growth, efficiency and competitiveness. The African Development Bank hazarded that Tanzania's ports, roads, railways, aviation systems and pipelines are in bad shape, and the worst of them is the port of Dar es Salaam. Tanzania-Zambia Railways, one of the region's biggest post-independence infrastructure projects, is still overwhelmed by derailments and breakdowns after almost 4 decades in operation. AFDB suggests that public-private partnership is the key to revive the overstretched and dilapidated transport infrastructure in Tanzania. PPPs can help public sector entities achieve better value for their money and increase innovation in their infrastructure provision of services. Africa's poor infrastructure is slowing its economic development. However, according to the UN report, foreign investment is helping fill in some of the gaps. Economic expansion in sub-Saharan Africa is projected at 5.4% next year and 2016. Philani Nyilunga, CNBC Africa, Johannesburg.
Joining me now in studio to discuss transport infrastructure investment is Andrew Maggs. He's an independent research analyst at Andrew Maggs Consulting. Richard Matchett, divisional director at WSP Civil and Structural Engineers. And in our Lagos studios, we are joined by Kunle Elebute. He's a partner and head of advisory service at KPMG in Nigeria. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Maybe start off with making that connection, if you will, between transport infrastructure and economic growth.
Well, to me, the economy is going to have to grow on a framework, just like you would grow any system around a framework of infrastructure. And transportation is probably the key to unlocking a country's potential.
So, Richard, we've heard from the insert, Andrew, we've heard from the insert and what Richard is saying now about the importance of transport infrastructure in the economy. But what is the state of play right now in Africa?
Well, I'd support what Richard says, and if you look at the two principal functions of transport infrastructure, there are many, but the standout ones for me, it's creating greater regional integration and then also facilitating trade. Now, if you refer to the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA being the acronym, they've conducted a study to see where Africa stands in terms of its transport infrastructure and delivery. And regrettably, it's failing in those two respects, regional integration and facilitating trade. And just by way of example, if you look at the Trans-African Highway System, which comprises, I think it's 9 corridors, and it's about 60,000 kilometers worth of highway network. Only about 40% of that is either dysfunctional or it's lacking entirely. So that, I think, illustrates the state of play and also the challenge, going forward.
Kunle, let's get an idea of the situation in Nigeria, especially when we're looking at a country that is sitting pretty with the biggest GDP on the continent. Would you say that the transport infrastructure is perhaps taking away from bigger growth that Nigeria could be experiencing?
Absolutely. The infrastructure in Nigeria for transport, it's very old. It's very it's archaic. It needs very serious investment in roads, in airports, in railway lines, in new ports. The capacity of the infrastructure cannot essentially foster the kind of growth we're looking for. and therefore you have massive congestion on this infrastructure, and lack of maintenance also means that the infrastructure is almost at breaking point. But just to go back to the point of my earlier colleagues on this discussion, one of the key challenges in Africa, the infrastructure that has been in place historically was put there by the colonial countries, whether it be French or the English or the Portuguese, and the infrastructure was put in place to suit their purpose, which was to suit the import of commodities from export of commodities from Africa and the imports of finished goods from the Western world. So again, the other challenge about the infrastructure in Africa for transport purposes is that it's not integrated to facilitate trade amongst African countries, and that's a big gap. So if we really want to have trade amongst African countries, we need to reorientate the infrastructure to actually link the countries together to facilitate trade across the continent.
How realistic is that proposition to rearrange the infrastructure network of a continent, in essence, such that it doesn't reflect some of those colonial legacies of the past?
Yeah, let's rephrase the question. We need to do it. Whether it's realistic or not, some things are very difficult. I just remember back to when cell phones first came out, and we thought, how realistic is it to have a pocket-sized phone in everybody's pocket? And most people have 2 or 3. Africa has to develop. Its road network has to be improved, its rail network has to be improved, and it has to happen across borders. We're already seeing in the SADC region a lot of effort to try and unify standards, unify rail gauges, for example, so that railways can cross borders. We're seeing the advent of one-stop border posts being planned and strategized to try and understand that. Those things have to happen. Africa as a continent is incredibly rich in wealth.
But let me interject. I mean, I think we can have the world's optimism about what we need to be doing in Africa, but without the funding, and maybe allow you, Andrew, to take this on, without the funding, none of this can happen, and we're sitting at a funding deficit for infrastructure. If I've got my figures right, that's $40 billion per annum. That's what we should be investing.
That's critical. I mean, without the funding, and we can discuss the sources of that funding in a moment, but without the funding, you can't construct the infrastructure. But just to quickly pick up on a point that Richard raised, there's just got to be a coordinated effort, whether that pertains to port, road, rail, and unfortunately, I think there are too many examples in the past where you've seen individual countries pursuing development agendas in isolation, and I think we've got to move away from that, and there's got to be a more coordinated approach which can allow greater cross-border installation of infrastructure. Going back to the funding, funding in Africa is still dominated by multilateral lending institutions. I'm thinking the World Bank and its various the institutions within the bank group that make it up. And also on the bilateral side, the World Bank being the major player. And I think I'm under correction, but I think last year around about 22% of its disbursements in Africa went into the transport sector. And in total, I think it's about 8.3 billion. That's their total investment spend in infrastructure in Africa. What we're seeing, unfortunately,
8.3 billion over what period of time are we talking about? An annual?
It's over a year.
It's over a year.
Yeah.
8.3 versus 40 billion that we need.
And remember, that 8.3 is not just for infrastructure.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can see there's a huge margin of difference there. Yeah.
I perhaps want to bring back the question that you raised at the end of your comment and maybe throw it back at you. Let's take Nigeria as an example. Are we finding that, at least from a government point of view, there are policies that point to a rethinking of transport infrastructure, and in particular a political will to put the money behind the plans for transport infrastructure?
Okay, let me answer the question in a different approach. Now, to go back to the question of the lack of funding, funding will only follow projects that are bankable. So the key thing, therefore, is if you want funding from private sector or funding from non-World Bank type financing, you need to make those projects bankable. Now, that then dovetails back to your question about what government policy must be in place to make transport infrastructure bankable. It's fairly simple. I mean, if the traffic numbers are there to for an airport to be concessioned, or for a port to be concessioned, or for a road network across the borders to be built, then the government needs to ensure that, you know, they need to de-risk the sector. I need to put in place policies to make those assets bankable enough for funders, for funding to come into place. Now, I mean, there's one new project in Nigeria, which is a second Niger bridge across the River Niger. And even though the traffic study hasn't been done, the government has to guarantee the traffic numbers for the first 2 or 3 years after the bridge is completed to be able to ensure that the funding will follow the project. And if the traffic is not adequate, then the government has to do a top-up after the bridge is up and running. And that bridge will bring traffic towards it, you know, if the toll prices and the tariffs are correct. So the bigger question about regional integration and making countries work together is that today in West Africa, for example, we don't need visas to go up to travel across countries, but we still have border posts. So trucks can't get through. You know, trucks have to spend 8 to 10 hours at the border post just to clear the goods, which is unrealistic. So beyond the visa issue, we need to, you know, we need to de-risk the border posts and make the border posts smooth enough to facilitate movement of goods and people across the borders. Now, once that happens, you know, then investors will come and say, I can do a road because I know that, you know, the road will be faster than air travel. But if it's Lagos to Ghana, it takes 2 days by road, but 45 minutes by air, why should I invest in the road?
Kunle, I feel like we've been having this conversation. If we go back to whether it's the OAU or the African Union, the integration of African markets has always been a point that has been talked about extensively. And yet it's 2014 and we're still having the same conversation. So where's the problem?
Absolutely. The problem is two sides. One is governments who have allegiances to their old colonial masters. So the Francophone region tends to work with France, and until they understand that for their own future has to be in their hands, and therefore cooperate with Anglophone Africa better, we're not going to move. You know, the Portuguese keep on working with Portugal, okay? You know, and so on and so forth. The Anglophone countries keep working with the British.
Let's take a couple of comments from Johannesburg. Before we go to the break, let's take a couple of comments from Johannesburg before we go to the break. Maybe starting with you, Andrew, and then we'll come to you, Richard. I'd
add to that quickly by saying I think there's still a fear or concern by African governments to truly liberalise the transport sector. And I think certain assets, whether it be, you know, ports or airports, are still perceived as being you know, crown jewels, and there's reluctance to let those out to private operators and owners. So I think that still stands as an impediment. And then also to pick up what Kunle spoke of about making sure you've got projects which are bankable. And I think of, you know, within our clientele, and that comprises construction companies, consulting engineers who are keen to participate in these projects, but frequently they are not scoped properly, and then of course there's the problem of actually processing these investments, and I guess this is up Kunle Street, providing adequate transaction advisory services to then make these projects happen.
Richard, I know you've got a comment, but I also want you perhaps to take on this question or this theme that seems to be coming up, that it's not a question of the availability of funds, it's a question of bankability.
Bankability in terms of a financial return, sure, that's always going to be an issue, and I think whenever we're looking at a concession-based approach or a triple P-based approach, we have investors investing for a return, sure, but one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves as a continent also is, are we not still in an expenditure need where we still don't have the basic infrastructure to be able to feed into? You can have a toll concession on a road, for example, but if your connectivity from the ends of that road into the city are not strong enough, you won't be able to produce the traffic required to pay the bills. So there is always a critical mass of support infrastructure for your primary infrastructure. Now, when we talk about transportation infrastructure, we're talking rail, ports, major roads. That's all very well, and oftentimes those get designed and positioned around your primary movement of goods and services. But we have to take it beyond just those key economic players into the society as well. And unless we start in our infrastructure planning, building in a certain societal resilience that can build economies, we're always going to be reliant on donor funding, on large triple Ps, etc. we've got to get to a point as a continent where we are self-sufficient. And I think that needs to be a long-term goal. It's not a quick fix, unfortunately, but that has to be part of the discussion, I believe.
And on that note of self-sufficiency, let's take a short break. When we come back, we pick up the conversation where we'll be looking at rail, port, road and air infrastructure as we look at the broader transport infrastructure state in Africa. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback, so send us an email. That's to investafrica@abn360.com or talk to us on Twitter. Our show's hashtag is Invest Africa, or you can also follow @NBC Africa or follow myself @NoziPombandra. Still with me, I have my guests, Andrew Maggs, an independent research analyst at Andrew Maggs Consulting, Richard Matchett, divisional director at the WSP Civil and Structural Engineers, and Kunle Elebute, partner and head of advisory service at KPMG, joining us from our Lagos studios. Welcome back, gentlemen. Now, we've seen a couple of deals on the South African front and indeed continentally, and maybe, Richard, let's get you to comment on this one first, in particular in the rail space. Lots of criticism leveled from the South African audience at Transnet for the interplay between foreign players and domestic players. Is there a balance that can be struck?
Well, let's start off looking at the criticality of the rail and its need in terms of us being able to export. Very, very important. Without talking too much on the deals, I think one of the big things to remember is without being able to move the freight, without being able to move the goods, it's we won't be able to function in the mining space. In terms of what Transnet is doing in unlocking those corridors, and also linked in with a move towards more beneficiation on home soil.
Yeah.
I think the bigger picture is improving our economy and enabling more jobs through technology transfer, through secondary industry, all of those very good moves.
Yes.
I was going to say, looking beyond South Africa, and I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for rail to compete against road transport. And I think over the last 15 years, I mean, you look at the freight volumes, passenger volumes as well.